I never spoke about those Sunday mornings, not even to my own daughter. I am 65 now, and my hands still remember every single detail. Before sunrise, the house always felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. Outside, the horses shifted in the barn, waiting for their slow journey. I would wake before anyone else, even before the first rooster called. The candle was already placed beside my bed from the night before. We were not allowed electricity, so silence was our only alarm clock. I would sit still for a moment, listening to my own heartbeat. Something about Sundays always felt different, like God was watching closer. I never told my husband what I truly felt on those mornings, because in our Amish home, feelings were often kept buried deep inside. First, I would step carefully onto the cold wooden floorboards. Every step mattered, because even noise felt like disobedience in our home. I would walk to the kitchen, where water was already drawn the night before. No running water meant every drop had to be planned carefully. I washed my hands slowly, like preparing for something sacred and heavy. My reflection in the metal basin looked older than my years. I often wondered if other women felt the same quiet fear, but no one ever asked such questions in our community life. Outside, the sky would still be dark, but not completely empty. I would hear the faint sound of neighbors preparing their own wagons. We all moved in rhythm, like one body obeying the same rule. That unity looked peaceful, but sometimes it felt like pressure. I remember tightening my dress collar before every Sunday service carefully. It was always the same dress, always cleaned and folded perfectly. My mother once told me appearance must never draw attention at church, so I learned to disappear inside plain fabric and quiet obedience. Still, my hands sometimes shook while fastening the small buttons, not from cold, but from something I never had words for. There was always a moment when I paused near the mirror. In that pause, I felt like I was hiding something from God. I would whisper a short prayer, asking for strength and forgiveness, but deep inside, another thought always tried to rise up, a thought I was never supposed to admit, even to myself. I would quickly silence it, fearing even my mind could be sinful. Then I would move to prepare breakfast for the family quietly. Bread, butter, and warm milk, always simple, always without complaint. My husband would enter without speaking much, just nodding once. In our house, silence between husband and wife was normal, but sometimes that silence felt heavier than any spoken argument. I remember one Sunday when my youngest child asked a question. She asked why I always looked so sad before church. I smiled quickly and told her it was only morning tiredness, but her eyes stayed on me longer than I was comfortable with. That moment stayed inside me longer than I ever admitted, because children often see what adults try hardest to hide. Outside, the horse buggy was already waiting near the gate. The wood creaked softly, like it was remembering every past Sunday. I stepped in carefully, smoothing my dress before sitting down. My husband took the reins without looking back at me. The horse moved slowly forward, pulling us into the cold morning. The road to church was always the same, yet never felt identical. Fields passed quietly, covered in mist like unfinished thoughts. I watched other buggies joining the path in perfect distance. No one waved too much, no one spoke more than necessary. That was our way, controlled and measured even in fellowship. But inside me, something was always restless before service began. Something I feared would one day become impossible to hide. As the church building appeared in the distance, my chest tightened. I remember gripping the edge of the seat a little too hard. My husband finally spoke one sentence without turning toward me. He said I must behave properly once we enter the meeting. I nodded, but my throat felt dry and strangely tight, because I knew Sunday service was never just worship for me. It was also the place where my secret felt dangerously close. And that morning, I realized something had changed inside me, something I could no longer explain, even to myself in prayer. As we stopped near the church, I saw someone waiting outside. A figure I had not seen in many years stood still. My breath caught, and the world seemed to slow completely. I knew right then that this Sunday would not be ordinary, and what I was about to face inside that church would expose everything. The churchyard was already filling when we stepped down. Horse hooves clicked softly against packed dirt and cold morning stones. Women gathered in small clusters, adjusting bonnets without speaking much. Men stood apart, hands behind their backs, eyes lowered respectfully. Everything looked calm, but my chest would not settle at all. That figure I saw earlier still stayed inside my mind. I tried to tell myself it was only a passing memory. But Amish memories never pass easily. They stay like weather in bones. I followed my husband toward the entrance with slow, careful steps. The wooden church doors looked heavier than I remembered that day. Each step closer made my thoughts feel louder and more dangerous. Inside, the air was colder, like the room held old prayers. Benches were already filling in quiet order, row by row. We sat in our usual place, near the middle section. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap without moving. My husband sat straight, as always, like posture was part of faith. Around us, hymns began softly, slow and steady like breathing wood. The sound should have calmed me, but it did not. Instead, I felt my mind drifting toward something I should forget. My eyes stayed fixed forward, but I noticed movement at the door. The same figure from outside had now entered the church slowly. He walked differently from the others, like he did not belong. I felt my body stiffen before I even understood why. No one else seemed to react, which made my fear worse. I lowered my gaze quickly, pretending to focus on folded hands. But my ears listened for every step that moved closer. The hymns continued, but suddenly they felt distant and thin. My husband leaned slightly toward me and whispered to sit properly. I nodded again, but my thoughts were already breaking apart quietly. I remembered something I had buried many years ago in silence. A winter evening, long before my marriage had ever begun. A moment I was never supposed to think about again. Yet that man at the door carried something familiar in his presence, not his face, but the weight of unfinished memory. I tried to pray, but my words felt stuck in my throat. The minister began speaking, voice steady like controlled fire. But I could not hear him clearly anymore. Every sound in the room now felt far away and underwater. I felt like the past was sitting directly behind me. My palms grew cold, even though the room was warm with bodies. I slowly turned my head just slightly, trying to confirm what I feared. The man was now sitting 2 rows behind us, close enough for me to feel his presence without looking fully. My breath shortened, and I pressed my hands harder together. No one in the congregation knew what was happening inside me. That was the rule in Amish life. Feelings must stay hidden. But this was not just feeling anymore. It was recognition. A memory I had never confessed even in private prayer. My husband shifted beside me, unaware of the storm inside me. I kept telling myself it meant nothing, just coincidence and age. But Amish life does not believe in coincidence that easily. Everything is tied to purpose, even suffering and shame. The sermon continued, but my world had already changed direction. I felt the weight of that man's presence like a silent question, and I realized something terrifying had followed me into this sacred place. Something I thought I had left behind many years ago, and now it was sitting behind me, breathing the same air. The sermon should have been the only sound in that room, but all I could hear was my own breathing, breaking apart slowly. The man behind me did not move, yet I felt him fully. It was like the past had learned how to sit quietly in church. My hands were still folded, but they were no longer steady. I remembered telling myself many years ago that time would erase everything. That belief now felt like something fragile and almost childish. The minister's voice rose and fell, speaking about obedience and purity. Those words hit me harder than anyone could ever imagine, because I had once tried so hard to live by them. I closed my eyes for a moment, just trying to hold myself together. But behind my eyelids, another memory opened without permission. A winter night, snow pressing against the barn like silent judgment. I was younger then, barely understanding what fear could become. That was the night I first met him properly, face to face. He was not supposed to be in our community that late. He had come seeking shelter after his wagon broke near our farm. My father allowed it, because Amish hospitality cannot be refused. I remember bringing him water, my hands shaking slightly in the cold. He thanked me quietly, his voice softer than I expected. Something in that moment stayed longer than it should have. Not love, not yet, but recognition I did not understand. I was already promised to my future husband at that time. But promises made by families do not always silence the heart. For a few days, he stayed near our land helping with repairs. Each time I saw him, I felt something I could not name. It frightened me more than it comforted me, even then. One evening, I met him alone near the edge of the barn. I told myself it was only to bring him food, nothing more. But the silence between us felt different from anything I knew. He asked me simple questions, but looked at me too long. I answered carefully, trying to keep my voice controlled and proper. Yet something inside me began to slip without permission. That was the moment everything changed without anyone noticing. In church that Sunday, years later, I realized he was back. Sitting behind me, carrying the same silence from that winter. I had never told my husband, never told my family, never confessed. Because in our world, such things are not allowed to exist. But silence does not erase memory, it only buries it deeper. My breathing grew uneven as the sermon moved toward its end. The minister spoke about truth rising in God's perfect time. Those words felt like they were aimed directly at me. I pressed my fingers harder into my palms, trying not to shake. My husband finally noticed and whispered if I was feeling unwell. I forced a small nod, pretending it was only heat and fatigue. But inside, I knew something had already begun to break open. The man behind me shifted slightly, as if he sensed my fear. That small movement felt louder than the entire congregation combined. I realized then that he had not come here by accident. He had come with something unfinished between us both, something I had spent decades trying to forget and bury. And now, in this holy place, it was rising again. The sermon was ending, but my real fear had only just begun, because I knew when we stood up, I would have to face him, and I was no longer sure I could hide anything anymore. The moment the congregation began to rise, my whole body went cold. Benches creaked softly, like the church itself was waking up. People started to move, folding hymn books, adjusting coats, preparing to leave. But I could not move at the same pace as everyone else. My hands stayed locked together, refusing to obey even simple intention. My husband stood first, waiting for me like nothing unusual was happening. I forced myself to stand, but my legs felt unsteady beneath me. That man behind me also rose, slowly, deliberately, without rushing. I felt it more than I saw it, like pressure shifting in the air. People began to pass through the aisles, speaking in quiet, respectful tones. But for me, every sound felt distant, almost disconnected from reality. My husband placed a hand lightly at my elbow, guiding me forward. I followed him, but my eyes kept drifting back without permission. The man was moving in the same direction, not far behind us. Each step he took felt like it was echoing inside my memory. We reached the outside air, colder than I remembered it being. The horses waited patiently, steam rising faintly from their bodies. Families gathered around wagons, preparing for the slow return home. I should have felt relief leaving the church walls behind me. Instead, the weight in my chest only grew heavier and sharper. My husband began speaking to another man about small farm matters. I stayed silent, standing near the buggy, pretending to adjust my shawl. But my attention was locked completely on the movement behind us. He was there again, standing a short distance away, watching quietly. Not staring in anger, not smiling either, just watching with time in his eyes. That look carried years I had tried very hard to erase. My throat tightened as I realized he was not leaving. He slowly stepped closer, just enough for me to hear him speak. His voice was calm, but it carried something heavy underneath. He said my name like it still belonged to the past. My husband turned slightly at the sound, confused by the familiarity. I quickly looked down, hoping silence could still protect me somehow. But silence was no longer strong enough for what was coming. The man said he had waited a long time for this day. Not in anger, but in something closer to unfinished sorrow. My hands started shaking again, even though I tried to hide them. I felt every rule of my life pressing down at once. Church rules, family rules, community rules, all standing inside my chest. He then said something that made the ground feel unsteady beneath me. He said he never forgot what I did not have the courage to say. My breath stopped for a moment, completely trapped in my throat. My husband finally turned fully toward us, sensing something was wrong. The air between us three felt tighter than any church silence. I realized then that I could no longer protect my past. Not from my husband, not from my community, not even from myself. The man was not here to destroy me. He was here because the truth had finally caught up with both of us, and for the first time in my life, I could not run from it. My eyes filled, not from fear alone, but from years of holding back. I finally looked up, meeting his gaze after all these years. Everything I buried inside me stood between us in that single moment, and I knew there would be no more hiding after today, because some confessions do not end quietly. They end everything you built. The morning sun rose higher over the buggy path as we stood frozen, and my life, as I had known it, was already gone before I spoke a word.